Dear Tom, you are in Athens now. You are in a summer school on modern Greek history. Would you like to talk about your experience in the summer schools?
Sure. Well, what we do is every summer we bring over 25 students and to come study in Greece for 5 weeks, a very intensive program. And what's different about it is ours is one of the few programs that focuses on the modern world. There are so many programs from the United States, North America, elsewhere in Europe, but they always deal just with the ancient world. It's as if anything in Athens doesn't exist after the 5th century BC. What I want my students to understand is how the country that they're staying in and living in came to be. Its modern development. So we focus on the political narrative, and the theme is transition from empire to nation state. And I try to get them to understand that at all periods, Greek history cannot be written just from one specific space, that it was always, we have to speak of a Hellenic world, a Greek world. So I want them to understand how the developments of the modern world were experienced in one specific place. And that's what makes it unique, is it introduces sort of global themes, how the modern world of the 20th and now the 21st century came to be, but then to connect it to real people, a real place. How did rural society, urban society here, how did they experience the Industrial Revolution, the demographic revolution? So it's to try to contextualize their understanding of Greece within a global context, and that's what makes it a unique program.
Oh yes, I see. So we would like to explain us more about this kind of connections between the modern trends in social and cultural history and the modern Greek history and historiography.
Sure. I think I tend to be an optimist in these things, but I tend to think that writing about the history of the Greeks, the Greek people, and moving away from the national framework, I think has been one of the most important historiographical developments of the last 25 years. In my view, the future of historiography is to move away from the nation-state frame. And when one does, then I think the study of cultures and societies like that of Greeks become even more important. When you adopt a nation-state framework, then Greece can be put onto the periphery along with many others, because as a country, one could say, compared to, say, France or Germany, it's on the periphery. But if you reframe it and ask about transnational flows, interconnections, multiple sites of interaction, take a question like identity. I think if we focus just on the national frame, you can say, okay, during the 19th century, there developed a canonical national identity. If you broaden the focus, then one finds, for example, that there were multiple Greek identity narratives in the 19th century. There was one that came out of Greeks in Russia, and multiple ones in the Ottoman Empire. The Ionian Islanders have a very different identity narrative of what it is to be Greek. So when you move beyond the national frame, I think Greece then becomes a very interesting and important culture to study when we look at transnational flows, interconnections, the way in which space and national space are created in contestation with broader entities. So for me in the 21st century, the study of the Greek world moves from the periphery to the core.
Mm-hmm. You have been educated in ancient history and archaeology. Would you like to explain us about this kind of transition and how this occupation with ancient world has influenced you in the study of the modern world?
Sure. But first, I actually didn't study ancient history. I never studied ancient history except as an undergraduate class. My intellectual formation was, as a student, an undergraduate, I was a double focus in classics and in anthropology. And in part, that reflected my personal formation. My mother being from Greece, I was always interested in things involving Greece. My father is French-Canadian and Native American, so I was drawn to the study of Native American cultures. So as a student, I was focusing in anthropology and archaeology, the study of native cultures, while studying 10 years of Latin, 10 years of ancient Greek. And I didn't know what I wanted to do with my career until I studied in Athens as a junior. And then I decided that I would focus on Greece. But this was a very, very important time intellectually in archaeology. It was the development of what was called new archaeology. And that was archaeology that moved beyond the study of sculpture and art and painting and architecture. And instead, new archaeology, which came out of America, said that archaeology is not about the things you find, but it's about studying the behaviors that produced the material culture and art that we find. So I was coming out of that background, and when I experienced for the first time Greek archaeology, I was shocked that it was still 19th century. It was all about sculpture and art history, etc. And it just so happened that when I was here as an undergraduate, I got to meet Professor Anthony Snodgrass, who had just been appointed to the Lawrence Chair of Archaeology at Cambridge, who wanted to bring new archaeology in. So he asked me to go to Cambridge to study Greek archaeology with him, but bringing this perspective, theoretically, that I had gotten studying in the US. So to get your question is, one of the things I think that I do differently is I look at the ancient period not as something unique and special, but try to understand it as part of a continuum. I think what one sees in terms of archaeology in Greece is you've got all this focus on the ancient world, a little bit on the period of Rome. Byzantium tends to be just about churches, and anything after the Byzantine Empire, it's not even there. So what I hope to bring that's unique as a perspective is to someone who approaches Greek archaeology and then brings in Greek history in ways that's different. One of the things that I think I've tried to do differently over my career is to try to bring together what here in Greece have traditionally been three different sort of discourses. The historical discourse, which until the 1980s was dominated by politics, macroeconomic history, international relations. Then you had the emergence of a Greek anthropology, particularly with anthropologists from England and America, and then the development of an indigenous anthropology. So you had a very well developed and very important anthropological literature. Then you had archaeology, and none of these three talked to one another. There was no intersection of these three discourses. Greek historians, because of their focus on the national issues, really saw nothing to gain from anthropology. Anthropologists studied Greece of the post-Civil War era as if it had no history. And then archaeology basically still studies the objects, the great objects from the past. What makes Greek so interesting is if you can bring those three discourses into dialogue. We've certainly seen much greater interaction between historians and anthropologists. The emergence, I think, of what we can call an anthropological Greek social history, which I think is very important. So I've seen that relationship with people I've worked with here, my students of other people's. Where we've not seen any interconnection is archaeology still is in its own separate sphere. And I think the challenge now is to try to bring these discourses together, to focus on what we can call human history. If we focus on human history, material culture, the social world more broadly, then history, of archival-based history, anthropology, and archaeology are discourses that can intersect. And that's really exciting. And to go back to my previous point, I think Greece is one of the few areas in the world that has such a well-developed historiography, body of anthropological work, and archaeology to call on.
Would you like to give us some examples on how you have used in your work this kind of three connections between history, archaeology, and anthropology, maybe in your works around the Ionian Islands?
Sure. In my work in the Ionian Islands, and published the books and articles that I've written, I've tried to connect in that way. So, for example, in my study of masculinity, violence, and honor, I used the literature, anthropological literature on honor, to try to make some sense of it. And so, I mean, my understanding of the interconnection between masculinity, the very high rates of interpersonal violence in the 19th century, and anthropology was, so my historical assessment was anthropologically informed. I think one of the problems that we've had in the relationship between anthropology and history is that we have to historicize anthropology. Where I've brought in archaeology in my work on the Ionian Islands has to deal with my focus on material culture. So in so many of my works I talk about, for example, how peasant or houses were organized, how farming was done. And in particular, in my newest book that's coming out, I really focus very much on the sort of material world. My entire career has been, if I was going to pick sort of a theoretical element that has been the foundation of my career, it's been materiality, not materialism. I consider myself to be someone who focuses what we used to call cultural materialism. What I mean by that is, my theoretical framework, I see the driving force of human society and human change, our interaction with the material world. So it moves beyond the simple Marxist materialism, because for me the material world is tools, objects, how we organize work, how we create space. Climate to me, landscape, are material. And so it seemed, what I've tried to understand is first the relationship of Greek society over the last 200 years to the material world and how there's that interaction. And then trying to explain historical change by looking at interaction between human society and the material world. The other element that I've tried to bring into my work is to try to connect macro-level developments with micro-level experiences. See, one of the problems that has beset Greek historiography is what I refer to as a publication like 20 years ago, was what I saw as a sort of ghettoization, that Greek historians in the traditional vein really spoke only to one another. And so there was this question of sort of how do we connect to the broader literature? If one adopts a perspective of trying to understand micro experiences of macro development, then it's not just, I want to move beyond comparison. I think if we look at, say, oh, well, what happens in Greece, say, in Italy, or Greece as Germany, then we get into this teleological issue. Well, should Greece have developed to look like a little England here in the Mediterranean? So the comparison one has a built-in evaluation, right? And that has led to the creation of this sort of underdog mentality. Well, we did not become England. Okay, well, no one did. If we move away from that comparison and say, okay, let's understand the broad developments, even at the global, certainly the European, Mediterranean level, then it becomes more interesting to tell individual culture stories as part of a larger narrative. So the way we get around exceptionalism, the way we get around parochialism, is to write the story of this area into the larger narrative. Not in terms of, again, doing simplistic comparisons, but understanding integration, flows, most importantly, how these macro developments and micro experiences are causally connected. That's the key here, is to show the causal connections. That's why transnationalism, focus on movements, flows, transferring of ideas, material culture, become really important. Because once we move beyond that national frame, it seems to me we open a whole new way of understanding history.
We would like to talk about the background, which are the subtext of your work. I mean your childhood or family experiences, and then how you connect yourself to the tradition of American a historiography on Greece, let's say, for example, historiography of MacNeil, Left Stavrianos, George Leon, and John Petropoulos. Most of them developed this kind of global perspectives on Greek history, like MacNeil and Stavrianos, or a kind of anthropological view on Greek history, like John Petropoulos. And then came in the United States Mike Hersfield and American anthropology on Greece. How you connect with this kind of movements? What kind of criticism you have on them, and how you see yourself in this kind of flow of American history on Greece?
Okay. Well, for much of my career, I wasn't considered part, even the next generation from that group. And even now, for some of that generation, both in America and here, they don't actually consider me a historian. They still call me an anthropologist. Or if they do, they call me a social historian, which clearly is not meant to be a term of praise. So my interaction with that group has really, personally, I know some of those people, but I've never been engaged with them much historiographically, because again, I came at the study of Greece through the back door. I didn't begin by reading those works. I had to learn the narrative, as it were, the big narrative, long before I had already become engaged with studying Greek agriculture, Greek settlement, Greek rural economy. So I see myself as connected to that group, but in some ways sort of charting a new course. And that was because, as great as their work was, their work didn't speak to broader audiences. With MacNeil and Stavrianos, who then moved to the macro level, yes, but they were writing world history. What they had done is really, so if you look, for example, at MacNeil's later work, like on music, etc., I mean, it has nothing to do with Greece at all. So they may have started working here, but then moved as the empirical subject. What I'm talking about is I want to keep as my empirical focus the Greek world, but I want to contextualize it into these broader contexts. So I sort of connect those two. Like some of that group, I remain committed to to grounding my work empirically here. I'm not going to switch research sites and go work on South Asia, right? I remain committed to writing about Greek history and society. So in that sense, I'm like part of that group. But I'm also like the other in that I want to contextualize it in larger frames. But unlike them, again, I'm going to remain committed to having my main subject here. What's interesting, I think, in the US is when that generation, if we look at institutionally, if you're trying to say, okay, in the 1960s and 70s, if you wanted to study Greek history, where would you go? There really was no place. And so all of those scholars you just mentioned, they came out of European history programs in which they were the person who did Greece, but there were no other people working on Greece there. It wasn't a program that focused on Greece. And so there really was no center for the study. I think one of the biggest changes I've seen in modern Greek studies, and certainly modern Greek history, is its institutionalization in the last 30 years, the last 20 years. So now one can say, if you want to study, say, modern Greek studies with a focus on literature, here are places to go that have programs, multiple faculty. If you want to study Greek history, here are the places you go. The other big development that I think that I represent that's different from that older generation, for me, you cannot study Greek history in the modern era without being thoroughly trained in Ottoman history. Both before the Kingdom of Greece and after, Greek history remains Ottoman history. And if you look back on those works, what's missing, it's so insular, and that's what I meant by its ghettoized. It writes about the Kingdom of Greece, say in Petropoulos, as if the wider Ottoman world doesn't exist. So the most exciting developments for me in Greek historiography from that previous generation is A, we've moved outside of the political to encompass cultural, social. We've now, again, looked at new frames, in this case, Ottoman history. So now we work together with colleagues who are working on them, and etc. It's more challenging, but I think that's the sort of reframing of historiography, and I think that's a development of about the last 15 years. I think here in Greece, in Turkey, and in North America, is again the recognition that once we get past the damnation state, then new frames of analysis must be used. In this case, we've got to look at the history of the 19th and 20th century of this area. It has to be regional. It cannot be based on political boundaries alone. Otherwise, we're writing incomplete and misleading histories.
Since 2010, Greece is in the front pages of the newspapers of all the world. And with the news from Greece, from the Greek disaster, there is also a version of Greek history that is somehow diffused around the world. So would you like to comment on this, on what kind of history is that, and how historians, as you or the historical community, with this kind of work could contribute in the changing of this image of Greece outside Greece, and in which direction?
Okay, I think that one of the main roles that historians can play in this is to demonstrate that where Greece is now is the product of a long and complicated history. A history that, again, has to be told at multiple levels. I think the discourse of mass media outside of Greece reduces everything down to simplistic character stereotypes. We saw this not just with the crisis, but I think we saw, I don't want to use the phrase Orientalist because it's not quite that, but what we saw is the application, the projection onto Greece of certain stereotypes. If you think about what was being written about Greece before the Olympics, oh, they'll never get it done. It's not going to be this. It's not going to be that. Whereas, in fact, it turned out that the Athens Olympics were better organized, the buildings and the infrastructure were better done than Atlanta was. Yet there was no discourse of worry about will America get it done, etc. So those stereotypes, I think, are what historians can help historicize. Also, I think historians can help to explain, and this is one of the biggest differences between academic historians and popular history, is contingency. Contemporary discourse is if this crisis was inevitable, that you put together the sort of long history of the sort of economic or underdevelopment of the region. So take the underdevelopment paradigm that came out of the historiography and the sociological literature of the 60s, 50s, and 60s. So you take that underdevelopment paradigm, add on to it then this sort of timelessness that, well, they've always been that way. And notice I said they. Then you put on top these crude cultural stereotypes about those people. And that's so anything that is reported outside of Greece is reflected through that lens. And I think as historians, what we can do is to challenge that, to focus and show that, yeah, where we are now is A, related to international developments. Let's not forget Wall Street and all the rest. So it's, once again, to put what happens in Greece into larger frames, and then historically to introduce contingency. It wasn't inevitable that this crisis would happen. There were specific developments where culture more broadly, the political class and others made decisions. So historians' emphasis on contingency, I hope can help us to explain to the general public that this didn't have to happen. It happened because of these factors, these developments, some more recent, some longer historical roots. And that's the other thing as historians we can do, is to show that, you know, there are longer roots to these developments. So there were shorter term pretexts, longer term causes, and again, I think the most important is contingency. To fight those crude cultural stereotypes, to fight this idea that this was inevitable, and again, to problematize it. And in order to do that, I think we've got to be, I think we in North America in particular need to be more visible in the mass media than we have been in the last couple of years, and that's our fault.
But you have been experimented with the new ways of historical representation, like the novel The Black Mountain, or the film you have done on the anti-Greeks riot in Toronto. Would you like to talk us about that?
Sure. I think that's one of the key ways in which we as historians can enter the public discourse. And certainly, I think the film I did, based on the book I did about the riot, anti-Greek riot in Toronto, what that showed me was how it's not just Greek historiography and Greek popular culture that seems unaware of much of its past. In this case, Canada was. So I think film, I think sort of writing academic books that address issues that people want to read about. And again, it's not so much saying that, well, if you work on Greece, no one who doesn't work on Greece is going to read it. That's not the case. If one writes Greek history or studies Greek society in a way that speaks to larger audiences and speaks to larger issues, people interested in those issues will read those books. Just as I think one of the most powerful ways of presenting material is through new media. I think things like documentaries and films, but I think taking more advantage of media, I think we should be doing more stuff that's on YouTube, media like YouTube, but I think we need to develop websites, facilities online for disseminating material more quickly. I think that's happening with e-magazines, some of which that you're involved with. I think that's a major step. But I think we need to be more ambitious and start to have more e-videos, more shorts, more material that's accessible to a larger audience in fashion that engages particularly younger people. I think it's really important.
Mm-hmm. Good. Emilia, would you like to ask something to Tom?
Well, taking a look back to the modern studies at US in Canada, I would like to talk about your experience in Canada and how the local community diaspora was involved in the formation of that kind of studies.
Okay. Yep. One of the things that I think one of the biggest boosts to modern Greek studies in America, North America, has been the involvement of the communities. I think when I spoke earlier about programs that are now anchors and attract large numbers of students. For example, we have, at my university now, we have 17 PhD students in Greek and Ottoman history, the largest anywhere outside of Greece. And that was able to be done because of the generosity of local communities. So one of the ways in which Greek history has been able to flourish in North America has been through private donations. Because let's be clear, in an American history department, even at any of the top 20 universities in America, if you look at the composition of their history department, chances are you're going to find maybe one person who does all of Southeastern Europe, Ottoman, Middle East, or maybe one person who does all of, quote, Southern Europe. Whereas you'll have 10 or 15 US historians, and your average history department, they have more historians on the American Civil War than all of Southern Europe, if all of Europe combined. So, in other words, if we had to compete in the academic marketplace of our universities, we would be the big losers. The reason why I think modern Greek history and modern Greek studies have been able to develop is because communities have stepped up, provided the funding to endow chairs, to establish programs, which then attract more resources. I compare, for example, the situation, say, of modern Greek history and modern Greek studies with, say, modern Italian history, modern Italian studies, Spanish history, etc. If you look in North America, modern Greek history is larger than both of those fields combined many times over. There is one chair of modern Spanish history in all of North America. There is only one chair in modern Italian history in all of North America. There are no chairs in modern Spanish studies. There are no chairs in Italian studies outside the Renaissance. So we actually in terms of the academic marketplace of ideas, modern Greek history and modern Greek studies actually has a larger presence than other cultures across the Mediterranean or what might be called the periphery of Europe. And that's solely because of the Greek American community, Greek Canadian community, providing the resources for us to do so.
So you have the experience of Greek history in Greece, of modern Greek studies in Europe, or in Canada, and in the United States. You have been involved with Modern Greek Studies Association. Would you like to talk about this experience, the difference from one country to the other, and most of that on the perspectives? Because you know that there is a criticism that although in Europe modern Greek studies are in a kind of, you know, disintegration and decline, in the United States on the other hand, you have a kind of development of institutions, programs, and things like that. Would you like to comment?
Sure. I think modern Greek studies, the Modern Greek Studies Association in America, in North America, I think is going through a transitional phase. I think at its first founding up until, I would say, the early 2000s, when I was president for 8 years, for 4 years, I think it was dominated by literature and anthropology, and it looked almost like an area studies focus. And then as intellectual history and actually intellectual currents changed, and we moved away from that, as I said, moving away from area studies, nation histories, etc., the Modern Greek Studies Association has had to redefine itself. And so now it's, I think, doing three things that are quite interesting. It's focusing more and more on the diaspora in North America, so it has a whole section now that deals with that. It's moved away from being so centered on literature and language teaching. And one of the biggest differences I've seen is, and I think this is a good sign, and it goes back to one of your earlier questions. If you look at all of those founding figures of the Modern Greek Studies Association, for the most part, the early historians you mentioned, all of them either came from Greece or were first generation. One of the things that I'm seeing that's very positive is that students are coming to study the Greek world who have no other connection. They're not heritage, they're not Greek American, they don't have ancestors here. They're coming because the subject interests them. That to me is a sign of real vitality, and I'm seeing that as well. So the Modern Greek Studies Association, and I think Modern Greek Studies in America, is reframing itself for the new intellectual climate. And I think what's been a real boon is, again, focusing on like transnationalism, trying to break down these borders. So the Modern Greek Studies Association has been much more active in connecting to other organizations, Gallant discipline, other regions, and so interconnectivity is, I think, the key. If you looked at the membership of the Modern Greek Studies Association in 1972, I would bet that every single name on there would be an obvious Greek name with the exception of one or two. That won't be the case anymore. And I think that's a sign of vitality. That the field is becoming intrinsically interesting, not because of people's personal story, but because it appeals to them intellectually. And that's, I think, very important.
Good. And how you are connected with your colleagues in your department? Do you have colleagues from East Asia, from Middle East studies, from people from all over the world? Would you like to talk about your tuning with the other peoples in the programs, in the seminars, or in the research programs?
Okay. Well, I think, again, my own work has been so interdisciplinary that wherever I've been appointed in numerous departments. But one of the nice things now in this department that I'm in is that we have, for the first time in my career, I'm at an institution where I have colleagues in my department who work in this part of the world. We have 5 people who work either in Ottoman, Balkan in the last 200 years. So we have a cluster there. But what's also exciting is we've developed a very close working relationship, as you suggested, with those from outside. So, for example, one of the courses we run that brings in faculty is we're doing comparative empires, and we're bringing in our colleagues from China to basically look at, with our Russian colleagues, so we're looking at the last of the great pre-modern empires in comparative perspective, China, Russia, and Ottoman. So we're looking at processes then of adaptation, modernization, partitioning, etc. So we're looking at comparative empires. A new thing we're going to be doing is we're going to have a year-long graduate seminar on civil wars that tries to understand civil wars and revolutions. Beginning with that basic definitions, what distinguishes a revolution from a civil war? Well, if you think about it, it's who wins. So take, for example, just take in U.S. history. Why is the American Revolution called the Revolution? Well, because the colonists won and created a new state. If they had lost and remained in the British Empire, it would be written about as the North American Civil War. The American Civil War of the 1860s. If the Southern Confederacy had won, the trope then would be of a war of liberation rather than a civil war. Here in Greece, in my view, for example, the Greek War of Independence, quote, is a civil war. It's written as, from one perspective, as a war of independence because that side won. So we're trying to look at, first, historiographically, how we understand revolution and civil war in ways that hasn't been looked at. They've been looked at as two different things. So in my view, every civil war or every revolution is a civil war of some sort, whether it be the French Revolution or any one. It depends who wins. So we're trying to problemize basic historical categories like civil war, independence movements, etc., and then to put them into comparative perspective, but also then to look at interconnections. What we're doing that's somewhat differently in this course is we're looking at how different movements around the world share discourses, shared imaginaries, shared canonical texts. That's why that's the importance of moving beyond compare and contrast. Look for the connections. So revolutionaries, for example, in the 18 teens in South America were reading many of the same texts that spawned revolutions in Poland, in Spain, here in when this was the Ottoman Empire, right? So it's to look at the connections of texts, people, ideas that moved about. And when one does that, one sees a sort of much more interconnected world. Just end by saying that much of popular discourse talks about globalization as if it's a new phenomenon. It's not. Globalization as a process has been around for, I would say, thousands of years. What we as historians have not done, particularly of the modern times, it's as if when the nation state appeared, globalization stopped. So, to go back to right from the very beginning, that's why this is an exciting moment, because we're moving beyond that. We're actually exploring now the sort of roots of interconnected global developments that continue right the way through the age of nationalism. As we move into a new age, which I don't think we have the adjective for yet, but I think what we are seeing is the end of the nation state, certainly as an intellectual paradigm. And so it should be on connections, flows, interrelationships, movements that define the new historiography.
Would you like to talk about your future projects?
Sure. I'm finishing now a couple of projects. One, which is a new book, which will be coming out next year, which is a study of the Greeks in the age of nationalism, from the late 18th century to the First World War. What makes that book different is it's not about the Kingdom of Greece. The rest of the Greek world doesn't cease to exist. So my story is geographically and empirically grounded as much in the Ottoman Empire, in Russia, and elsewhere as it is here. So it is first a social history. It's a social history that's not bounded by any specific space, but again tries to focus on these elements that I've been talking about. So I think that's going to be somewhat new. Again, it's going to be the first, certainly in English, the first specifically social history of 19th century that again will tell the story of Greek society inside the kingdom, but outside it as well. Then I'm completing this micro-history on the called the Murder on Black Mountain, which is a micro-history which again speaks to larger issues about an event in 1849. Speaking of multimedia, that actually may be made into a motion picture. A studio is interested in making that into a motion picture. But what I want to do with the next phase of my career is to try to create, or to help create here, a new field, and that will be historical archaeology and social history. I want to bring together, as I mentioned earlier, those three discourses. And I think, I think I'm one of the few people who can do that because I am an archaeologist. It's what my training is. What I want to do then is to help develop the field of studying the archaeology of modern period, basically from the fall of Byzantium, post-medieval archaeology here in Greece. It's a field that seems to me Greece can become a leader. Those of us working in Greece, we can go to the forefront of that field simply because of what's been done here in Greece. So my next big project is to study, try to integrate history, archival-based social history, archaeology, study of material culture, the study of natural environment over the last 500 years. And that includes excavating, studying material remains all around the countryside. Now, part of that is because that's historical information. But because no one in Greece has cared about that, we're in danger of losing here an entire source of information. The villages, the houses in the countryside that now lay abandoned, that can be studied, that in fact are the raw material to study the social history of the more recent past. So this type of work not only has an intellectual function, but it also has what I would call a public function. We're going to record the landscape and what remains on this landscape of this country over the last 400 years before it vanishes completely. So part of it is an act of cultural preservation, what in America we call cultural resource management. We're going to try to create, as it were, a complete material culture database of all the remains that are extant from, say, post-medieval right up to the 20th century. So I'm going to dedicate much of the rest of my career to trying to bring the circles into union and to combine the study of archaeology, material culture of the modern period with archival-based material, with anthropological comparative material to try to write social history. Because if you think about it, if one wants to write the history of non-elites at any period in this country, certainly in the 19th century, what sources does one have? All the sources we have about real people in the 19th century and even the 20th century comes from official documents, travelers' accounts, people writing them. How do we find the authentic voice or the authentic remains of material in the past? Well, that's a sector of society was not literate. We don't have letters, diaries, etc. But what can speak to us is their material culture remains. So combining then the archival, the material, with an anthropological perspective holds the promise of defining a new field that I think Greece can be the leader of, and that is the study of historical archaeology in Europe of the post-medieval period.
What's the three books you have influenced you more on your work?
The first, and it reflects the three fields that I connect, history, anthropology, and archaeology. The first one is history. When I first read E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, I basically read it in 2 sittings. And as you know, it's about 1,000 pages. I was just so impressed, not just with the beauty of the writing, but the way in which he was able to write a very politically informed history. I mean, this was new social history at its finest. This was the new Marxist history at its finest. Unlike, say, the other Marxists I read, like Hobsbawm, who basically hammer you with the theory. In Thompson, it's all under the surface. It starts with a narrative. It starts with a man sitting in a pub, A working man writing a working man's tract. There's not a word of theory in in Making of the English Working Class, but it is one of the most theoretically informed books I've ever read. And I said, that's the way you write history. You should be like a duck on a pond. Your reader should just see the duck gliding across. They shouldn't see the theoretical work going on underneath. It's there, but you don't have to hammer your audience with Foucault or Marx or Derrida or whoever. Write the history, write your study, let the theory flow out of your analysis. So I said, that's the way I want to write history. And if I've even come close in any of my works, I would take that as the greatest compliment. Second person came out of anthropology, and that was Marshall Sahlins. His book, Culture and Practical Reason. A small book, but it had the greatest influence on me. I was doing my PhD at the time, and I was doing fieldwork on Ithaki, and I was staying in Vathi. And I couldn't do fieldwork because it was raining every day. So I had two books with me. I had Das Kapital, and I had Culture and Practical Reason. And let's just say that my copy of Culture and Practical Reason, every single page came out, whereas Das Kapital, let's just say, wasn't used as much. I read Culture and Practical Reason numerous times, sitting there in the rain, in the Cafeteria, sipping some coffee with a bunch of old Greek guys, all of them former sailors, and smoking cigarettes with them. And that book profoundly impacted the way I looked at the world, because what I saw in Sahlins' work was a way to write a materialist perspective that was not burdened by material determinism. What he showed was the contingency of materialism, and that profoundly impacted me. The third one was by a scholar who crossed anthropology, archaeology, and environmental studies, and that was a scholar at Berkeley named Robert McNetting, who wrote an incredible book called Balancing on an Alp, in which he combined the study of demography, agriculture, social history, all the stuff that I was doing on the Ionian Islands, combined it with an environmental perspective that also showed how, in his case, how this remote village in the middle of the Swiss Alps, studying it, told us about the creation of the modern world by looking at that. So his perspective influenced me in understanding the role of the environment in society. And I guess I should say there's a fourth, because the other one person who really influenced my thinking was Charles Tilly. It's from Tilly that I developed this idea that one should always connect micro and macro. That's the other thing that I've tried to do in all my work, is how I'm a social historian who wants to know how real people lived, fought, died, had sex, did everything. But if we how do we make that not antiquarian or trivia? Why should we care about how you grew olive on Pelion? You care because studying how you grow olives on Pelion tells you about macro-level processes of global integration, economic development, etc. So Tilly wrote a very, very small book called something like Big Processes and Small Experiences, or something like this, in which he argued that, again, how the challenge for us as social historians is to connect micro and macro. The problem with old-style microhistory is it never really did that well. New microhistory is doing that. And so that's where my formations come from. Someone who's rooted to the micro, but always with an eye to the macro. I hope I'm someone whose work is theoretically informed, but the theory is not foregrounded, it's underneath. And someone who studies the material world while hopefully avoiding the trap of materialism.
Okay, thank you very, very much for this really enlightened discourse.